So please help me welcome Ted Waddell and Mike Leslie.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming out. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here tonight with all of y'all and with Ted, and to see colleagues here that I had for many years. She said I was former chief curator here for about 24 years and retired, was fortunate enough to retire about a year ago. And anyway, Ted and I go back. We met some 20, almost 30 years ago, I want to say, when I was at a museum in Indianapolis, and I had the privilege of working with him on a couple of small exhibits and also on a major retrospective of his works at the Idle George Museum. And so I've long had a thought of bringing his works here at this museum, and had the blessing of being able to come up with this show and then have a staff, Susan Patterson, Melissa Owens, and others, that when I said I'm retiring and then also said, would you mind finishing this project, they did not mind. They pitched right in, and as you can see, the fruition of their labor really is what you see around the room with working with Ted. And so what we thought we'd do a little bit tonight is I had come up with a series of questions to ask Ted, and he's going to respond, and if we don't know the answers, he and I we won't break into song and dance, but we will make up a good story to tell you. So I do have a few questions to ask, and then what we'll do is open it up for you to ask Ted some questions that you might have about the artwork. And so let me start with this, and you know, I often look at...
One thing, before we do, I'd like to thank the board of directors and Susan and Melissa and Gretchen and all of the folks here that put this together. And without Mike, this would have never happened. And if you understand the Idle Museum, it's a museum of Western art. And in the early 90s, Mike broke that mold and invited me. And as a result of that activity, they did a number of shows called the New West, in which they invited artists from all over to participate in those activities. So because of Mike and the vision of the board and the staff here is the reason that I'm here, and I'm very honored to be here.
Right.
So now we can go on.
You know, if you look at and think about art, it's really just a visual language, if you would. It's a visual dialogue. And if you think of it as that, then it's really a form of communication between the creator and the person who is viewing it. And what often happens, though, is the viewer is viewing a work of art without the background of who it is that's creating that work of art. And so the first question I have is, you know, I know Ted have known him for a long time and know a lot about him. And he's really a very multifaceted person, and his background is amazing. None of y'all would understand or know that unless you had that chance to really get to know him in a way that I have. And so what I would ask Ted is, you know, of all the things that shape who you are today and as an artist, what, you know, 4 or 5 things about who you are really helps define what you create. If somebody was looking at a work, they could see what it is that makes you tick.
It's the ground. It's the land. The land shapes where we are, and the land shapes what we do and how we think. And right now, I mean, if you think about our country, most people move on an average of 7 times during their lifetime. And so also because of those movements, there's no responsibility to the ground. And so we have people who don't care about the ground, but the ground shapes what we are. It determines what we are. You folks know this from being here. I know this from being in Idaho and Montana and sometimes Wyoming. It's the ground. It determines who we are. It shapes us. It shapes the way we think. And people really forget this in the city, because, you don't care about the person down the street or that sort of thing. But it's the ground that determines. And then there are also, for me in the West, I come from a long line of storytellers, and also everybody in Montana knows everybody else. Same thing in Idaho. And so there's a communion of people there in the most wonderful kind of way. I ran cattle for 30 years, so everybody knew everybody else who was running cattle that you cared about. But it's really that kind of tradition, and I come from that, and I am that, and I'm very proud to be that, and it shaped my entire life, and I'm so glad to be so. I went to New York as a kid, and I could have stayed in New York and whatnot, but I had to come back to Montana. Montana's big time for me. It's the most diverse and varied terrain that you'd ever want to see, from the mountains in the west to the plains east of Billings. I swear, if it weren't for the curve of the earth, you could see from Miles City to Minneapolis. But it's wonderful, and it shaped my life. What was the question?
So, very good, very good. You mentioned about the land, and you are a third-generation Montanan, as I understand, as I recall, and you also have been a very successful rancher, not just an artist, but a rancher. And so not only is the land important, but the subject matter for which you paint and the places that you paint, you know very well. These are, they're not just the titles of the paintings, but they're places that mean something to you. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that heritage that you have with ranching, since your subject matter is so much drawn from that agrarian lifestyle. I was really lucky in so many ways. I quit a tenured teaching position to take over a ranch west of Billings with no experience. They called us egg-headed professors, and they were right. And I had been in New York in '62 and studied at the Brooklyn Museum. And during that time period, I ran into people like Franz Klein and Pollock and my all-time favorite, Motherwell. And so when I moved to the ranch, from having done sculpture, I was teaching at the university, and I was making sculpture then, and in the narrow mountain valleys north of Missoula, a 16 or 20 foot piece made sense. But when I moved to eastern Montana, where you could see 150 miles in any direction, that no longer made sense. And so one of the things that you do is you make a change. And if you look at a painting, one of the things that you agree to is the illusion. Sort of like when you go to a movie, you agree to that context. Okay? The same is true of paintings. So you can create vast amounts of space in terms of a canvas. And so that made the transition for me from a sculptural background in the western mountains to the plains in the eastern part of the country. What was the rest of the question? Well, it was about the importance of ranching in your work and knowing the subject matter.
Well, and too, I'm sitting at the kitchen table looking out, and we bought black cattle. And the reason we bought black cattle is because of the pigmentation, they tend to stay warmer, and unlike Hereford cattle, they don't get blister bag or cancer eye. So we bought black cattle. So I'm sitting at the kitchen table right after we got there, and I look out the window, and all of a sudden I see all these Motherwell pieces going by me. And I saw a little movie of Motherwell doing these lyrical kinds of pieces on a floor. And I saw these, okay, all of a sudden the light went on. And that was, a long time ago. And so I've loved them for my whole life. They took care of me for over 30 years, and I've been painting them forever, and I'm absolutely nuts about them. It hasn't changed at all. Lynn and I have run cattle together for 20 years near west of Bozeman, but also then we've run pairs on our place in Haley, and they're wonderful. I mean, they're just incredible. You just want to hug them. I've been writing a book about that, and one of them is I would hug a cow if I could, and I have.
Very good. One of the things that really just is a bond between Ted and I, and my father and I had a small ranch operation, so I knew the cattle industry and had worked around it pretty much all my life. But also, the first museum I worked at had American print collection, but it was very heavily weighted towards the modernists, and so I got to work with works by Frank Stella and all of the great Motherwell and Helen Frankenthal and all of those people, and I learned to appreciate what looked like just colors on canvas. That a friend of mine was a printmaker and helped educate me on what to look and how to see artwork differently. And so I think our discussion tonight is really about helping people learn to see what the artist sees. And so one of the things also is interesting to me is Montana. We all know Montana for being known, it's known for Charlie Russell. But Montana also is really a unique crossroads of a very diverse group of artists that either track through there or are drawn to Montana for various reasons. And it runs the full gamut from Russell and Remington and that group, but also all the way to John Singer Sargent, to Jackson Pollock, to a host of people that you wouldn't think of. And so Ted has teethed on, I think, a lot of diversity of artists and art approaches, and so I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the people that have kind of influenced your work along the way.
Well, one of the things that happened is in this past 3 years, because of a wonderful writer, Rick Newby, we've published a book called My Montana, and it's about my history during the last 40, 50 years. And one of the things that sort of tends to happen is that people think that the world ended when Charlie Russell died in 1926, and it really hasn't. But also, I didn't know this, but when the research was being done for this book, it was discovered that my grandfather knew Charlie Russell, and there's a photograph of him in a cow camp with Charlie Russell, and he shod Charlie's horse Monty. So I have a connection that I never knew about. I thought all of my relatives were just middle-aged thugs. But the tradition in Montana is deep and wide, and it's covered by people. There's an incredible cadre of writers that go back to A.B. Guthrie, Big Sky, Dorothy Johnson, and I taught with people like William Kittredge and Jim Crumley. Jim Crumley wrote about Milo Mildragovich, who was a detective from Butte, Montana. Crumley was incredible. He kept writing all the time because he had to satisfy ex-wives. But there's a wonderful writing tradition there that continues to go on, and that's fed a rich kind of activity. And the same thing is true of art. Rudy Audio and Peter Vokas, whom some of you may know about, were arguably the best and most wonderful ceramic artists in the world. And they single-handedly changed the entire ceramic world. And so these folks were around all the time, and I was very fortunate to be a part of that. The other thing that happened simultaneously almost is the Poindexters. The Poindexters had a gallery in New York in the early 80s, and Mr. Poindexter was from Helena, Montana, so he wanted to give back to Montana. So they gave some 800 pieces of art to the Historical Society in Helena, which then spun off to be a large part of the Yellowstone Art Museum collection. And it was the first time that any of us had seen modernist works in Montana forever. And so all of these things were kind of going on simultaneously. And I was lucky to be a part of it. I was a dumb kid, so I didn't know, but I was a part of it.
Kind of following up on that, one of the people that you often credit for your background in the art world is Isabella Johnson. And there's an interesting story that you have told, and you touched on it just a little bit ago about being in New York. And so I wonder if you might talk about the accidental hearing issue that you had and that led you to New York and what that meant.
I was a student of Isabel's, and at 17 started college in Billings, and which was almost serendipitous. And I met Isabel, and I was going to study architecture because it was the closest thing that I knew to art. Because when I was in high school, you could do mechanical drawing, and that was pretty much it. Now the whole world has changed with regards to that. So I found Isabel, and within a few weeks of knowing her, decided I didn't want to be alive and not make art. And that was nearly 60 years ago, 59. So I'm studying with Isabel, and we're doing this and that. And I used to go to school on Monday, and I wouldn't go home until Thursday, and I would stay overnight, and I made friends with the security guys, and so they would come and have a coffee with me at 2 or 3 in the morning, and so they let me stay there. So I was that intense about studying. Well, Isabel was standing outside in the hallway, and she was talking to a grad student, and she said, you ought to apply for a scholarship to the Brooklyn Museum. Well, I thought she was talking to me. So, no, true story. So I applied for the scholarship and I got it. So I turned 21 in New York, and I studied at the Brooklyn Museum, and then I got a job with a wonderful man, Mortimer Brandt Gallery on 57th Street, and so I worked for him, and I'd go to work for him, and I'd work for him and then study and whatnot. And towards the end of that year, he invited me. He said, "I'll send you to grad school in art history, and we'll go to Europe every year and buy paintings." It scared the hell out of me, so I mailed him the key to the gallery and hitchhiked to Provincetown, where I spent the summer making art. And I never had more than $20 in my pocket at any one time. Had a marvelous time. Hans Hoffman was there, and Norman Mailer was there at the bars hustling all the young women and whatnot. It was a marvelous year, but it was because of this accidental activity.
So things do happen by chance sometimes, yeah. One of the things that I've always really been drawn to your works has to do with you allow me to come into the work. You don't give me all the information. You allow me to look at a piece and to draw my own conclusions, to really ignite my imagination and draw me into the painting, and in a conversation that doesn't happen when somebody gives such minute details that I can walk by it and say, that's very nice and it's aesthetically beautiful. But when I walk by your pieces, and I've heard it talked about that, it's kind of like driving down the highway and you see something out the corner of your eye that's very interesting, and you get drawn in, but you don't know all of the details, but you are able to use that imagination. So looking at your artwork, there are 3 aspects to it that I think, and that's the subject matter, the texture, the composition of that, what you paint, and then the colors, the way you use colors. And I wonder if you might just talk about that a little bit, and how you go about choosing what you include, but also how important it is what you don't include in your paintings, and if that makes sense.
I'm not sure it does, but that's okay. I can't tell you anything about these creatures that I paint, except that I can tell you how much I love them. And also, for me, I don't like to be directed. I don't take directions well. So maybe that causes me to paint in a certain way because I don't want to draw any conclusions for anyone else. I would like the work that I do is to let you know how much I care, not only about the animals, but about the landscape and the place, that's so that you can engage on your own and come to your own conclusions. I only paint things that I can see. A lot of artists now, and especially with the digital age and with the internet, can get easily distracted because there's so much information out there. But you have to remember that that information is somebody else's. It's not yours. And that's really unfortunate when artists get distracted by that, because you can get misled. Also, photography really can fool you. Unless you know what you're doing, it can really fool you. So relying on something else in order for your sensations to be real doesn't work for me. I have to see it. I have to see it, and I have to see it often. It's almost by rote in a certain kind of way, but it reinforces my soul in a way. I mean, I've probably seen 1 million cows, but I never get tired of it. The same way with horses. And in recent years, I've been painting elk because we see elk in our pasture 50 feet from the house. And then I've been painting buffalo as well because of Ted Turner and the ranches in Montana. So I get to see them, but I have to see it. I can't do it any other way. With regards to color, darned if I know. Winter is my favorite season, and I know a lot of you say, "Well, we have to go someplace warm in the winter." I want to be in winter because the thing about winter is it changes your perception, it changes your behavior, it changes everything. Everything changes in the winter if you're in snow. I mean, it's totally different. And I've always loved that. And also some of it, I suppose, has to do with calving. I never got to paint in the summer because we were haying and combining and all of that sort of thing. And so winter was it. And plus, it provides, what I want to say, a kind of privacy that you can't experience any other way. It just envelops you in the most wonderful kind of way. And because painting is singular, then this adds to that activity. With regards color, people look at things and they say, well, snow is white. Well, it's not. Or they say grass is green. Well, it's not. And Mike and I have talked about this a little bit. I've tried to understand green for about 40 years now. Never done too well with it because most of the terrain that I'm familiar with is not green. It's ochre. It's, valley farmers think grass is green, and when you're up on the prairie running cattle on those ranges, it's not. It's yellow. So I've been working on a book, and one of the essays out of the book is called Yellow Grass Country, and so my sense of color is a lot more subtle because of being on the high plains. Does that make sense? Yeah. Well, maybe not.
One of the things I would urge you as patrons and visitors to the museum, Ted and I had a chance on Monday to walk through the permanent collection and look at the various artists and some of the works, and it was really amazing, and it kind of had hit back home to me the number of works by artists that you wouldn't necessarily think in terms of abstract or an impressionistic approach. The number of works in our permanent collection that really do have elements, very strong elements in their composition that are very much what Ted paints here. And it ranges from, you can go right out here and look at Frederick Remington's In From the Night Herd, and it's very much an abstract piece. And you go into Wilson Hurley's piece, and you often think of Wilson Hurley being a very realistic painter, but if when you look at it and study it, there's very much abstract qualities to that make it what it is. And so all of this really has kind of caused me to rethink and look at our own collection here quite differently. And I think, we often, I think, pigeonhole artists get stuck or kind of purposely or unpurposely stuck into a routine or a category, and it's hard for them to get out. And you talk about that you really never have that problem with artist block or like a writer's block. You will talk to artists where they paint to a point where they can no longer focus or get cross. But you don't have that problem, and why is that?
I don't know. I'm a worker. I work. In the early days, because of my history, was the heyday of the abstract expressionists, and so you'd see some of these guys hanging around waiting for inspiration. I don't do that. I work. I mean, I have a really strong work ethic, and so that's what I do. And things happen. You go to the studio, and there's some days when things go better than other days, and there are some days that you have where you can't do anything wrong. But you have to go through the hard times before you get to the good times. And so I'm very disciplined. I mean, I don't, it doesn't matter. I just keep going. And then in retrospect, you looked at some of these things and you say, well, some were better than others, etc. And so periodically I destroy pieces. That's an honest way to do things. But I'm a worker, and so I have that discipline all the time. I'm just bullheaded too, I guess.
I guess one last question I would have is just looking around the room, and one of the things that easily strikes me is not just the variety of subject matter and approaches, but just in scale. I mean, you have very, very large pieces, very small pieces. You have works that are oil, you have works that are paper, you have works that are prints. And so talk a little bit about how what is it that draws you to that, such a broad spectrum?
In the early days, when I first started painting, we did small pieces, and then what I used to do is I'd go to the lumber yard and you'd buy 2x4s, 8 feet long, and then you'd have them rip them at an angle so that when you stretch the canvas, it wouldn't touch the board wouldn't touch the canvas. And so all of the pieces during that time period were 3x4, 3x5, 4x5. They were all on that scale. And in the last 25 or 30 years, there's a wonderful company called Head Stretcher Corporation that makes all of my stretchers. And so I can get stretchers, they're all made out of poplar, and so I can get stretchers any size I want. And they don't warp and whatnot. And I've always felt, and I didn't get to do it in the early years, but in the last 25 or 30 years I've been able to do this, is I feel like there's a scale that's appropriate for each idea. So I have a wonderful young man, Luis Morales, who works for us full time, and he does all of my stretching, he does all of the priming and whatnot. So in my studio right now, I probably have close to 100 canvases of different sizes that I can work on. So I can pick 12 by 12 square painting, or I can pick one that's 6 by 10 feet, and I like that. So I try to deal with what I do relative to scale and the ideas, and it's a wonderful sense of freedom to do. What was the other part of that?
Well, just about the difficulties, or what you find that why you're drawn to such a variety of size, and also working in different medias.
Well, when you work on paper, there's a whole different perception because of the relationship between our hand and a piece of paper and graphite, and so the scale is different. The whole sensation is different, and for some reason I've always done works on paper, and then early on in my career I did part of my graduate work in lithography, and so I've been making prints forever. And the thing about making prints that's different is that you can learn more about color by doing prints than you can any other way, and that's because when a piece of paper goes through the press, it goes through at about 600 pounds per square inch. So you can put a very small amount of pigment on a piece of paper, and then the result is really brilliant, and you don't really understand that at first. So I've spent my entire career doing prints. It's sort of started, we all made potato prints when we were kids, and I guess I never got over it. Anyway.
So, okay. Let me open it up to the audience. If you have a question for Ted, feel free to ask. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Ted, you mentioned you paint what you see.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean on site or in your memory?
Yes. I have done plein air painting, and I do that periodically. I haven't for a while, but I used to take. I have done this, is to take a trailer and canvases and go out and about. I used to take the dogs in a horse trailer. The dogs would go with me, and we'd run around here and there and go from Wyoming to Canada and back down and paint. So I have painted on site. The other thing that happens to me is I have to see it, and it becomes imprinted on my memory. But having said that, like the Monaida Angus over there, I've been over Monaida Pass at least 200 times. And so you see it, and it becomes imprinted. The other thing that I do is I do take photographs, but the photographs really have to do with light. You start seeing these compositions, and it requires a leap of faith. You have to bypass your intellect. Intellectually, we organize things in a certain way. Painting isn't like that. At some point, you have to give it up and believe. It may not make any sense, but I have to do that, because to do it intellectually at a certain level is okay. And I do that structurally because I'm very serious about how the composition is very important to me. How you structure the paintings and what goes on. They don't teach that anymore in college. I don't know what they teach, but they don't teach that. But that's very important to me, and so you do that, but at some point you have to give it up and believe. Does that make any sense? Yeah.
But as a follow-on, as
Sure.
you're in your trailer with your dogs and you're out painting,
Yeah.
is this what I know as plein air?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a wagon, one of the wagons where you drag it around at the plant store to get your plants and whatnot. Well, I put a pallet on top of that, and so I would stop the trailer and drag it out and start painting. And, some of them were good, some of them weren't so good. I was in a show, the last big one that I was invited to be in a show that dealt with artists who had been influenced by Yosemite. And so I spent a week there. And, of course, being the modest type that I am, I started only 14 pieces while I was there. But it was wonderful, because I painted every day for 12 hours a day. And but that was part of the deal, yeah.
Yes.
I haven't had a chance to look at your through some different pieces. And so I was wondering if what the time period is that all of these work is represented. We're talking a small amount of time,
This is a long period of time. There are paintings here that I did in the 80s. And then the last painting that I did for this show is this big piece here, and I did that about less than 4 months ago. I did it I finished it about 10 days before Melissa came to choose the show. And so this is the most recent, but it covers from the 80s. I don't think there are any pieces here that were done prior to like 1980, but so it covers a fairly broad spectrum.
Could you talk a little bit about, like, this piece looks very different than that one, and maybe some different things that you were working on over the course of that time span?
Darn if I know. Well, one of the things that is important to me, I don't want to replicate what I do. I want to learn. I don't want my work to be the same next year as it was this year, that sort of thing. And I want to learn from what I've done. And so I hope that in the course of you looking at this exhibition, you'll see an evolution, a change. I don't know if it's good or bad. I just want it to be different. I don't want to stand in one place. A lot of artists get trapped either by their iconography, their culture, or the demands of the market. I've had kids come up to me and say, "Well, how do you become successful?" And my response always is, "Well, you work for 25 years and I hope the phone rings." But I want to change. I want to be better. I would like to be better and different than I am now. And I ultimately, you folks will decide whether or not that's happened. It's out of my hands. I mean, it really is.
Yes, you had a question?
I heard somewhat of a story earlier tonight. Something may have happened on a trip to South Africa. It had something to do with the volume of paint, and has that still had an influence on your painting today?
I was represented by a gallery in San Antonio, and they had a connection to South Africa, and so they said, "Well, if you want to paint wildlife, come to South Africa." And I said, "All right, I'll come." And I was painting really thick paintings during that time period, and there's one back behind you that's quite thick. And so when we got ready to go, I ordered 55 gallons of oil paint. Yeah, really, because I was buying it by the gallon to be sent to Johannesburg. Well, they kept it on the deck, on the dock in San Francisco for compatible shipments. So it didn't get there for 9 months after I got home. So when I got there, I didn't want my trip to be ruined, and so I bought tubes of paint. I spent, I think, I want to say $18,000 for paint, and I would just go to the store, and I didn't even look. I would just get a big cardboard box and just scoop tubes without even looking into the thing. And my record for using tubes of paint one day was 58. But what it caused me to do is to learn to paint in a different technique, to try to get some of the same effects without painting so thickly. So it really changed my technique in a really good kind of way. It was a great trip. True story. Mostly.
Any other questions? Any thoughts?
Any thoughts? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I understand your love of Montana and Wyoming. It's a very, very beautiful place. Is there a particular terrain that you really prefer to paint? I've noticed you've got the mountains here, you've got nice meadows, and is there any particular thing that you like to focus on more than anything else?
Yes and no. In Montana, if you're west of the mountains, which would be west of Bozeman, it's all vertical terrain. They sell that, the real estate guys, that they're selling vertical landscape. East of the mountains, from east of Livingston, say, all the way to the Montana border, it's high plains, and where the ranches that we had were really pretty high plains, kind of broken, buried terrain, and so that was really important to me for a long time. Well, now that Lynn and I have been living in Idaho, the mountains have become more important, and then we have a house and studio east of Dillon in southwestern Montana, and this big painting was done, it's called Beaverhead Angus, and so I know exactly where that is, and so, yeah, so it goes back and forth, but Montana and Idaho, Wyoming, the terrain is the most varied in the world. The only other place that I've ever been where you could understand perspective other than Monaida Pass is in Cimarron, New Mexico. In Monaida Pass, you can go over the pass and you look, and you're standing there and you're looking at a cow on, perspective, and then you look to the horizon, and those pastures are 50,000 acres, and they look like fly specks, and then the fence line recedes to like a pencil drawing, and it's palpable stuff. I love it. Can't get enough of it.
Have you ever done the Tooth of Time there in Cimarron?
No, we went to Cimarron to visit some wonderful women that Lynn photographed for a museum project. I can't remember that. There's a little museum there that's terrific. Yeah, you probably know it. I can't remember the name of it now, but yeah.
So did you ever go to the Big Bend country? I know you said you've been as far south as Midland, Odessa, but did you ever go to Big Bend? Have you ever got a perspective of that?
No, sir, I haven't.
You should.
Okay.
You do well. No, it's unbelievable. Please go see that landscape someday.
I'll do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question in the back?
Yeah, I was just curious that obviously you're really passionate about painting and art. And I was just wondering what part of it is your favorite part?
Say that again?
Most emotional for you?
What draws you most to painting, being an artist? What is it that gives you the most joy?
I'm not sure. I guess it's really difficult to answer. I won the lottery, and I won the lottery in the sense that when I met Isabel Johnson when I was 17 and was struck by who she was and what she'd done, and made the decision that I didn't care to be alive and not do anything else, that was a beginning. And it's never changed. I mean, I've had that passion for my entire life. I can't work like I used to, but the passion isn't changed. I just can't work as long. But I don't care much about anything else, and I really don't, except my dear Lynn and our creatures. And I paid the price for that too. With relationships and family activities, but for some reason that chord and that love has never diminished, and I still don't want to be alive and not do it. I don't know if that answers your question, but it just that's who I am, and
Well, I was just trying to get to a different place, but I think
oh, go ahead, keep going. We can.
trying to kind of answer your question about how come he never gets burned out on it and why he never needs motivation is because I think that the process of it is what he enjoys so much, that yes, the finished product is awesome, but I think he really enjoys the whole process, like seeing landscape is beautiful, and then painting it just extends his passion of that, and then he has the painting at the end, and every time he looks at it, he still gets that emotional drawback from it.
That's true to some extent, but you know, there's nothing like putting a half a pound of paint on a big old palette knife and going whoop. You know, it's sort of like covering an angel food cake with a lot of frosting. Yeah, it's as good as it gets. And then, as you see, in retrospect, some of the result is really wonderful, and some is not so good. I mean, you take the good with the bad, and there are days when I paint when it doesn't go too well, but you keep doing it because of the discipline, because you know that you're going to get the good stuff at the end. At some point, you're going to get the good stuff, and so that's what you do. You know, maybe I'm just dumber than hell too.
Let me, one last question.
Sure. Do you come from an artistic family, or you talked about writing and your painting? Do other members of your original family or any of that?
Well, I always tell, I mean, until I understood that part of my history had to do with Charlie Russell, I always thought my relatives were middle-aged thugs. My dad was a painter. I mean, he painted boxcars for the Northern Pacific Railroad. But one of the things he did, and I don't know why, when I was 8 and 9 years old, there were men in the community that were craftsmen or they painted, and he made a point of taking me around to see what these guys were doing. And then the other thing he did, we would go to the library, and we would rent or check out books by the bagful. I mean, literally, the grocery bags full of books. So every morning, before he went to work, we read, and then we read together at night. And so I think, for some reason, that started. I can't tell you why.
He had it in him.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, I mean, he did paint by numbers, and the first winter he wouldn't let me touch them, so I just sat and watched. The second winter he let me paint in a few. I still have those. Yeah, after all these years, I still have those. Yeah, so.
Okay, let me draw this to a close, and certainly appreciate all y'all coming out tonight. If you want to hang around just a little bit to ask Ted some additional questions, you're welcome to it. But again, thank you very much for coming, and thanks, Ted, for sharing your work with us.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.